Hey guys, tonight we drift through England's long shadows, where kings built worlds that time forgot. You're standing at the edge of history's great disappearing act, tracing the ghostly footprints of Henry's lost palaces. Once these places pulsed with velvet laughter, torchlight on carved oak, the scent of roast swan and rosemary. Now, just damp earth, fractured brick, and the sigh of the wind through nettles. You probably won't survive this tour. Not because of danger, but because the thought of how completely a kingdom can vanish might melt your brain before we're done. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start where the road narrows beyond South London, where grass grows in uneven humps over what once was majesty. Beneath your boots, if you could peel back the centuries, lie the bones of courtyards and galleries that shaped England's swaggering Renaissance. Henry VIII didn't just build palaces, he built a stage for himself. The Tudor world revolved around royal spectacle, and each palace was a performance. The king as sun, courtiers as constellations. Yet weirdly, almost all of those suns are gone. Richmond, Nonsuch, Oatlands, Greenwich's Placentia vanished, as if the ground itself conspired to hide them. Historians still argue whether it was mere neglect or deliberate erasure after Henry's death, when later monarchs dismantled his excess brick by brick. Maybe it was both. Maybe the empire he envisioned couldn't survive the weight of its own walls. You imagine walking through the skeleton of Nonsuch, that boast of marble and gilded stucco, now buried under suburban lawns. The very name taunted rival kings. None such as this. And yet, you could drive past its site today and never know. Somewhere beneath an innocent housing estate lie shards of majolica, a few surviving tiles glinting like memories that refuse to stay buried. You picture the ghosts that linger, courtiers in peacock silks, ladies adjusting jeweled sleeves, Henry himself striding across a courtyard of checkerboard stone. His laugh is big enough to fill the sky. The man was addicted to grandeur. His palaces were his mirrors, reflecting power back at him. And like mirrors, they were fragile. Crack one and the image splinters. A fact that tends to surprise people. Henry owned more than 50 palaces. That's more than any other English monarch before or since. It's easy to think of him as the bloated tyrant of late portraits, the heavy-set face, tiny eyes, that glitter of pride. But in his prime, he was magnetic, athletic, the ultimate Renaissance influencer, curating image before Instagram existed. Each of his palaces was an extension of his ego and his insecurity. Eltham for pageantry, Greenwich for ceremony, Hampton for passion, Whitehall for politics, and then the others smaller and stranger, hidden in countryside fog. Hunsdon, Otford, Woking, half retreat, half display. Each one stitched into the geography of power like jewels in a crown. But unlike jewels, they weren't cut to last. A quirky tidbit, Henry had a soft spot for movable luxury. Portable tapestries, collapsible furniture, temporary banqueting houses. Also, his magnificence could follow him wherever he went. Think of it as the 16th century version of a traveling influencer setup. So when his palaces fell out of favor, so did their contents. By Elizabeth's reign, some were already gutted, their lead roofs stripped and sold to pay soldiers. You stand in one of these lost footprints now, maybe at Greenwich Park or Richmond Hill, and try to imagine what used to stand beneath your feet. The birds sing, joggers pass, and somewhere under the soil lies the heart of Henry's world, reduced to shards and outlines. It's easy to romanticize what's gone, but these weren't fairy tale castles. They were engines of control. Rooms built to display hierarchy, corridors arranged so courtiers would cross the king's gaze exactly as he wished. You would have hated it if you weren't born noble, the smell of tallow, the weight of etiquette. Yet the spectacle was undeniable. Still, even the grandest engine rusts. The dissolution of the monasteries, wars, and the financial hangover of Henry's own ambitions left the crown scrambling for cash. Successive rulers recycled his palaces like spare parts, pulling down walls, melting lead, reusing beams. You can almost hear the hammering of workmen dismantling a dream. There's something haunting in how silence reclaims power. The idea that a king who terrified nations can leave behind nothing but earth mounds and place names. Palace Green, King's Meadow, that's all that remains. Maybe that's the lesson hidden in the rubble, that everything we build to immortalize ourselves eventually becomes compost for the next age. As the night deepens, you keep walking. A fox darts across a patch of ivy. Somewhere behind you, a train hums, oblivious. The lost palaces are still here in their way, spread out like phantom constellations across England's landscape, waiting for you to connect the dots. And so the journey begins. You move through the thinning trees as dawn barely lifts the mist, and there, quiet as an exhale, lies what remains of Eltham Palace, once a crown jewel of England, now a memory dissolving into ivy and sparrows. You step onto ground that once shook beneath the boots of knights arriving for Christmas feasts, so extravagant you'd need a nap just from looking at the menu. Today, the air smells of wet leaves and aging stone, a far cry from the cinnamon-spiced warmth Henry VIII knew here when he was still young, charming, and surprisingly good at jousting. Eltham is where the king grew up. People forget that. Before the beheadings, before Wolsey, before 6 wives and a national religious meltdown, he was a boy racing down these very slopes, shouting challenges to the wind. One mainstream historical fact historians always point to, the Great Hall at Eltham, whose battered bones still stand, was one of the most magnificent in England, rivaled only by Westminster. Imagine a roof soaring like an upturned ship, hammer-beam trusses carved and gilded, sunlight pouring through high windows onto tapestries thick enough to muffle an army. The place was built to impress ambassadors, nobles, and anyone Henry felt like intimidating before lunch. You tread across the outline of that hall now, the cracks in the stone almost forming a kind of accidental map. Birds hop along the ancient floor plan, tracing where tables once groaned under feasts. The huge hearth, cold, broken, used to hold fires so massive that servants sweated through winter. You half expect a page boy to rush past you, carrying a flagon of ale and muttering about missing choir boys. And somewhere in the wind you catch the faintest echo of a lute. Or maybe that's just your stomach making noises again. Eltham was never only a palace, it was a performance arena. During Henry's youth, Christmas was the season for masked dances, elaborate stage plays, and courtly flirtations that would have you blushing behind your goblet. You picture the king, then still a prince leaping across polished floors, his red hair glowing in torchlight. Historians still argue whether his musical talents were exaggerated by sycophants, but most agree he loved performing. If TikTok existed, he'd have gone viral for sure, probably playing the lute while wrestling a boar. A fringe tidbit for you, one of those details that sticks in your brain like a rogue splinter. Early accounts suggest Henry kept pet dogs at Eltham that were fed on diets more elaborate than what many commoners ate in a month. These pampered palace pups reportedly had velvet cushions and occasionally wore tiny embroidered coats. You're imagining that now miniature Tudor fashion icons waddling around the court. And honestly, it adds a new dimension to the phrase absolute monarchy. But even in its glory, Eltham was already fighting the geography battle. It sat far enough from London to feel peaceful, close enough to be convenient, but not quite close enough for a king obsessed with politics to stay here forever. As Whitehall and Greenwich grew in importance, Eltham slowly slipped from center stage. It's like being the early breakout star in a TV series, only to realize halfway through season 2 that the writers have moved on to newer, shinier characters. You climb what remains of a staircase, half rubble, half stubborn stone, and pause where a balcony once overlooked courtly dances. Moss clings to the stones like the palace is trying to grow itself a blanket. The trees whisper overhead and you get the strange sensation of trespassing, not on property but on memory itself. The palace doesn't resent you, though. If anything, it's relieved someone still cares enough to look. Below you, the old moat glistens faintly. It used to be crossed by a bridge that nobles clattered over in full regalia. Now, ducks rule the place. They paddle through water that once reflected banners and torches, and you have to respect their entitlement. If you were a duck living atop centuries of royal drama, you'd strut too. Another fact as you wander: Eltham played a crucial role in medieval and early Tudor diplomacy. Foreign envoys were welcomed here, dazzled by the hall, and softened up by entertainment before any negotiations began. Nothing loosens a political stalemate like 30 courses of roasted meat and wine that could knock out an ox. But by the time Henry hit middle age, Eltham became less practical. London pulled court life inward, towards bureaucratic machinery and away from pastoral luxury. Yet even as the palace declined, people kept tinkering with it. One of the oddest transformations came centuries later, when wealthy millionaires in the 1930s rebuilt part of it in glamorous Art Deco style. Yes, Eltham briefly became a time-travel mashup of medieval grandeur and sleek, modern curves. You walk from a 15th century Great Hall into a 20th century ginger-end chrome drawing room. Historians still argue whether this restoration was preservation or architectural fan fiction. But tonight, you're drifting through the Tudor ghost of the place, not the polished modern reinvention. You brush your hand along a stone ledge and feel the cold bite of centuries. You imagine Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York, packing these corridors, worrying about alliances, pregnancies, and court rumors. You imagine servants bustling with baskets of linens. You imagine musicians tuning lutes in an alcove. And somewhere in that bustle, little Henry, rosy-cheeked, restless, chases a falcon handler or sneaks extra pastries from the kitchen. Maybe that's why the ruins feel strangely gentle. They remember a version of Henry unburdened by power. Before the crown weighed on him, before heartbreak and paranoia and those questionable decisions involving marriage licenses and execution warrants, he was simply a kid running around Eltham's gardens, trying not to fall into the moat. You wander toward those gardens now, mostly vanished, but hints of them cling to the landscape. A slope here, a terrace there, the faint ghost line of an orchard. The Tudors loved organized nature, orchards arranged like chessboards, herb gardens smelling of mint and rue. If you squint hard enough, you can almost see it. A young court lady plucking rosemary, a court jester pretending to drown for attention, a guard trying very hard not to laugh. And that's the strange charm of visiting a lost palace. You're not walking through ruins, you're walking through layers. Every step presses into a stack of forgotten moments. Banquets, coronations, secret conversations behind arras curtains, arguments over who stole whose pheasant pie, the silences after big decisions, the thrill before big celebrations. It's all here, even when nothing visible remains. You sit on a crumbled wall for a moment, catching your breath, listening to distant traffic humming like a modern choir. Every so often a bird shrieks overhead, as if announcing yet another invisible court arrival. You glance around and think of how relentless time is, flattening palaces into parks, kings into footnotes, and monumental halls into mossy ribs of stone. Yet Eltham still holds dignity. Even in ruin, it carries that echo of something grand, something human, something flawed, brilliant, and fleeting. You rise again, brushing dirt from your hands. Night seems heavier now, the air thicker. Ahead, the path narrows under the arch of trees. You step forward, leaving Eltham behind, not because the palace has nothing left to say, but because it has whispered what it needed to whisper. And there are other ghosts waiting for you, other palaces, other lost worlds. Your journey continues, and the night deepens. You follow a narrow lane curling through Hertfordshire farmland, the moon riding low enough to snag on treetops, and there, quiet, unassuming, lies the land that once cradled Hunsdon Palace. You feel it before you see it, that gentle shift in the air, like the landscape is trying to remember itself. Most people drive past without noticing anything but hedgerows and the occasional fox streaking across the road. But you're standing on the threshold of a childhood home for two Tudor queens. No big deal or anything. The wind stirs the grass, and suddenly the outlines appear in your mind, the shape of a courtyard, the echo of stone walls, the sense of being watched by long-gone lives. Hunsdon was never the flashiest palace, not like Greenwich's glitter or Hampton Court's swagger. It was sturdy, warm, and slightly chaotic, kind of like the royal equivalent of the cousin's house where you hung out as a kid because the snacks were better. This place meant something to Henry VIII in a quieter, more domestic way. He inherited it from his father, Henry VIII, and while he sometimes used it as a hunting getaway, because naturally the king needed at least 6 different places to chase deer, Hunsdon eventually became a royal nursery. That's the mainstream historical fact here. Princess Mary and later Princess Elizabeth spent parts of their childhood within these walls. Imagine tiny Tudor princesses learning their letters, chasing dogs through corridors, and occasionally being scolded by nannies who were definitely underpaid for the amount of royal tantrums they had to handle. You walk across the uneven ground where the nursery once stood. The grass ripples around your shoes, whispering. You picture Mary, serious even as a child, trying to learn Latin declensions while her tutors sighed dramatically. And Elizabeth, sharp, curious, probably already side-eyeing everyone with that legendary intelligence she'd later weaponize as queen. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's childhood here shaped her love for countryside retreats later in life, but it feels right. Hunsdon was where she tasted something like stability, even with court politics swirling around her like storm clouds. You step closer to a low ridge of stone, the faintest ghost of a foundation. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you brush your hand across the rough surface. Hunsdon supposedly had one of the earliest indoor privies with an efficient drainage system, which for the 16th century basically made it the Ritz. Visitors reportedly gushed about how unusually fresh the palace smelled. You're laughing imagining tourists reviewing it like, 5 stars, would relieve myself here again. But the palace wasn't always comfort and royal baby giggles. The deeper you wander, the more you feel its stormier history. This was a refuge during outbreaks of plague, a retreat during political upheaval, and occasionally a place where inconvenient relatives were quietly parked out of the way. Henry VIII was many things: charismatic, tyrannical, heartbreakingly indecisive about marital loyalty, but above all, he was strategic. Hunsdon gave him both distance from London's chaos and a site essential for staging northern military operations. You follow the faint line of what used to be the Great Hall. It wasn't grand like Eltham, but it was hardy, solid beams, thick walls, a ceiling that trapped warmth. Henry even had the place fortified during his reign, adding towers and defensive features. Not that anyone ever launched a full-scale attack on Hunsdon, unless you count toddlers attempting to eat furniture, which honestly seems plausible. A gust of wind rolls over the fields, carrying the scent of damp hay. You imagine servants trudging through mud, carrying baskets of firewood or jugs of ale. The clatter of horses in the courtyard, the sighs of tutors, the soft footfalls of Mary or Elizabeth tiptoeing down staircases, determined to read forbidden books or sneak extra dessert. You pause and smile, because there's something charmingly normal about the idea of future queens being told to go to bed right now, young lady. These walls saw them before the crowns, before the history books, before the weight of ruling an island kingdom settled onto their shoulders. But the palace also has shadows that cling to the corners of your vision. You sense a heaviness near the place where the chambers once stood, as if old anxieties still hum beneath the soil. Mary spent part of her childhood here during some of her darkest early experiences. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, being pushed aside, Mary herself declared illegitimate. Hunsdon sheltered her body, but it couldn't shield her heart. You imagine her packing the gardens, staring toward the horizon, wondering what was happening to her mother miles away. Elizabeth's memories here, though, feel lighter, like sun patches on a cold day. Even after becoming queen, she visited Huntston and granted it to her cousin, Sir Henry Carey, her loyal favorite. She even made him Baron Huntston, an honorary title born from the soil beneath your feet. The palace became a lifelong anchor for them both, even as its structure slowly began to decline. You take a deeper step into the grass, letting the blades brush your ankles. Somewhere beneath you were kitchens. Country Tudors loved food almost as much as Henry loved, well, wives. You imagine cauldrons bubbling with venison stew, the crackle of fresh bread coming out of the oven, the chaos of kitchen boys trying not to burn down the hall. Life here was bustling, intimate, raw in a way court life rarely allowed. The moonlight catches something, just the edge of an old well lined with stone. You crouch near it. Water still lingers at the bottom, a dark mirror. You lean closer and feel a chill. Wells in royal palaces were both lifelines and rumor traps. People whispered secrets near them, assuming the wind would swallow the words. If this one could talk, you'd probably hear everything from servants complaining about itchy uniforms to ambassadors plotting manipulations to princes whining about early bedtimes. You rise again, sensing how Huntston balanced two worlds, the soft domestic heart of royal childhood and the harder edges of political usefulness. The palace was never meant to be Henry's showpiece. It was a practical fortress with a warm interior, a place where the future of England toddled around in embroidered shoes. You walk toward the orchard area, though the trees now are wild descendants, not manicured Tudor fruit bearers. The ground is uneven, but as you move between trunks, you sense it. The past here isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It hums like a lullaby, low and steady. You picture Elizabeth plucking apples, the sunlight making her red-gold hair flare. You picture Mary sitting under a tree, reading scripture, determined to hold onto something constant. Modern houses blink in the distance, windows glowing faintly. Cars hiss along distant roads. Civilization presses in from all sides, but Huntston keeps its secrets close. This place was never destroyed dramatically like Nonsuch or devastated by fire like Whitehall. It just faded, eroded by time, neglect, shifting ownership, and practical demands. Outbuildings were torn down, main structures collapsed, materials repurposed. The slow erosion of a life once so vibrant you could taste it. A fox pops out from behind a shrub, looks at you with intense judgment, probably because you've interrupted its dinner plans, and darts off into the darkness. You chuckle. The fox is, at this point, the unofficial palace warden. You take one last long look at the land. The night air grows cooler. Somewhere far off, an owl calls. You can almost sense the girls moving through the landscape, echoes of laughter drifting between the trees, shadows of royal futures not yet written. Huntston doesn't shout the way other palaces do. It whispers, and sometimes that's louder. Your journey deepens with the night. You leave the soft hush of Huntston behind and move toward London, where the air thickens, the roads narrow, and the shadows grow sharper, like the past itself is bracing for what comes next. Because tonight you're stepping into Bridewell, the Tudor palace that went from royal lodging to something far darker. It's one of those places history tries to forget, like that embarrassing phase where you dyed your hair neon blue and pretended it was intentional. Bridewell didn't just fade, it transformed violently, and the earth still remembers. You're walking now along the Fleet River's old path, though it's mostly buried under centuries of city grit. In Henry VII's day, the Fleet was a bustling waterway, smelly, yes, but busy with boats carrying grain, stone, timber, gossip, and the occasional questionable cargo that nobody wanted to declare at customs. Bridewell Palace rose along its banks, sturdy and proud, a new expression of Henry's swagger after his break with Catherine of Aragon. This place was meant to dazzle ambassadors and intimidate rivals. It didn't take long for it to start doing other things. You pause under a street lamp. Cars hiss past, neon signs flicker, and yet the moment you close your eyes, the centuries peel away. You can almost smell the sawdust and freshly sawn timber from Henry's renovations. Bridewell was originally a medieval residence, but Henry expanded it, added galleries, chapels, elegant chambers. Imagine a palace with river breezes drifting through carved windows, torches flickering along corridors, and courtiers packing in embroidered slippers. That's the mainstream historical fact here. Bridewell wasn't built as a prison. It was meant to be luxurious. But kings change, and so do buildings. You step onto what once was the inner courtyard. You can almost hear the applause from diplomatic banquets, the clatter of armor, the whispers of ambassadors trying to gauge Henry's latest mood swings. This was the palace where Henry met with Catherine to discuss their annulment, one of the most emotionally fraught moments of his life. Historians still argue whether Henry chose Bridewell deliberately to unsettle her, using a space associated with royal authority to press his marital case. The political theater here was intense, the rooms practically vibrating with tension. Then, like a switch being flipped, the palace's fate turned. After Henry's death, Bridewell was gifted to the City of London by Edward VI. And that's when the place went full plot twist. In the mid-16th century, Bridewell transformed from royal palace into a house of correction, a place where the poor, the homeless, wayward women, petty criminals, and anyone deemed inconvenient were sent for labor and punishment. The walls that once echoed with courtly music now rang with cries, shouts, and the clank of iron restraints. You take a slow step forward. The shift in the atmosphere is immediate. The air feels denser, as if the ground itself is remembering too much. A quirky tidbit about Bridewell, one that makes you wince and snort at the same time, concerns the famous Bridewell whipping post, where offenders were flogged publicly. People actually gathered to watch, like it was some grim Tudor version of reality TV. There are reports of spectators bringing snacks. Imagine sitting there munching roasted chestnuts while someone's getting punished for stealing a loaf of bread. Peak Tudor energy, dramatic, judgmental, and a little bit unhinged. But Bridewell wasn't just a punishment center. It was supposed to be rehabilitative. In theory, inmates were taught trades, spinning, weaving, sewing, to become useful citizens. Whether that noble intention matched the grim reality is a different story. Historians still argue whether Bridewell's labor system was genuinely reformative or just a convenient way to extract cheap work from the vulnerable. You walk the perimeter slowly, tracing the ghost line of walls now buried beneath London streets. There's an odd weight to this place. Other Tudor palaces are romantic ruins or gentle footprints. Bridewell is different. It has sharp edges even in absence. You can sense the layering of stories. Royal ambition smothered by civic discipline, luxury overwritten by hardship. You crouch near what would have been the gatehouse. In Tudor times, the entrance was imposing, carved stone, heavy doors, guards in livery. Upstanding citizens entered through one side for court business. Inmates shuffled through another. The duality of this place was dizzying. A building that started as a bedroom for kings became a holding cell for the powerless. And yet glimmers of its past refused to die. You run your fingers along a surviving fragment of foundation stone built into a modern wall. Cold, firm, unapologetic. Bridewell never pretended to be something it was. Even as a palace, it had an air of pragmatism. Even as a prison, it kept its rigid structure and discipline. You almost admire its consistency in a dark, strange way. You wander farther, imagining the rooms Henry once strolled through. You picture him packing the gallery, turning the annulment over in his mind. The scent of beeswax polish in the air, the distant hum of a lute, the sound of Catherine's voice trembling but composed as she insisted on her rightful place as queen. That moment, lodged in these walls, changed England. Religious shifts, political upheavals, the birth of a church that still shapes lives. All of it echoed first through Bridewell. Then you imagine those same rooms a few decades later, floors scuffed by wooden shoes, straw bedding piled in corners, overseers shouting orders, looms clacking endlessly. The transformation is almost jarring. You're standing in the middle of a before and after montage with no credits and no explanation. A fox darts across your path again. Apparently these lost palaces come with complimentary fox sightings, and pauses to stare at you with a "you good" expression. You nod at it like you're sharing a grim secret. The fox decides you're weird and trots off. The night deepens and the city hum darkens into something softer, like a lull beneath London's endless heartbeat. You close your eyes and listen. Beneath the modern buzz, you hear the older sounds: water lapping against stone, boots on flagstones, a stern voice reading out punishments, a child sobbing quietly, a master craftsman teaching someone how to spin flax, a queen whispering a prayer, a king whispering a curse. Bridewell contains multitudes. You move toward the far corner where the old chapel once stood. Chapels in Tudor palaces were grand. This one had tall windows, carved stalls, and a sense of solemn authority. When Bridewell became a correction house, the chapel was still used for services, but the tone shifted from royal devotion to moral instruction. Imagine sermons about sin and redemption echoing in a room once lit by royal candles, resonating against stones that remembered kings. You step closer to the river's buried root. The Fleet River saw everything: barges full of goods, bodies thrown in during plagues, court messengers, prison barges. If rivers kept score, the fleet would have a ledger thicker than Henry's waistline in 1547. As you stand here, you can't help but marvel at how places outlive their own reputations. Bridewell became so infamous as a punishment site that its royal origins were almost forgotten. Even today, the word Bridewell is used in some places to mean police station or holding cell. A palace name turned into a synonym for incarceration. It's like calling your local jail the Ritz. Actually, no, it's weirder than that. A drizzle begins to fall, London's eternal signature. You pull your coat tighter and imagine the rain falling through broken roofs centuries ago, dripping onto prisoners huddled together for warmth. You imagine servants sweeping puddles out of palace rooms, grumbling that the roof repairs will take forever because, well, the king has other priorities, Brenda. You linger a bit longer, tracing the invisible edges of where the palace once stood. Bridewell isn't cozy like Hunston or grand like Eltham. It's a reminder that history isn't just jewels and banquets. Sometimes it's raw, uncomfortable, and startlingly human. And then quietly you feel it, the sense that Bridewell is done with you. This place doesn't cling, it releases. You exhale and step back into the night. Ahead, the path bends toward the Thames, where another vanished palace waits in the fog, another fragment of Henry's world calling you deeper into the maze. Your journey continues. You move deeper into the hedgerow-broken countryside, the air cooling as the last orange streaks slip behind the trees, and without really thinking about it, you find yourself angling toward the river. The Thames has a way of pulling you along its spine, and tonight you follow it to a place that should feel royal, but instead feels like you've trespassed into a dream someone forgot to finish. This is Nonsuch Palace, or rather the ghost of where it once stood, Henry VII's greatest vanity project, the one he proudly named because there was literally none such like it. And yet, as you tread across a field that ripples with wild grass instead of marble courtyards, there's nothing left but the faintest memory of gold leaf catching candlelight. You didn't sign up for a royal disappearing act, but here you are, stepping through the outline of ambition turned to dust. The ground is uneven, the soil oddly warm beneath your boots as if remembering centuries of construction work, court festivities, and the echo of boots far fancier than yours. A fox flicks its tail in the undergrowth and gives you a stare that clearly says this used to be prime real estate. What happened? The truth is a long story, and you're walking right through its last footnotes. Henry VIII didn't just build Nonsuch, he obsessed over it. A mainstream historical fact. The palace was decorated with elaborate stucco reliefs that were so intricate ambassadors described them as bewildering to the eye. Scenes of classical gods, Tudor power icons, mythic beasts, basically the Renaissance equivalent of someone showing off a super expensive 3D printed trophy wall. And the king made sure everyone knew these designs were cutting edge. Art historians today still drool over the descriptions alone. You drift along the imagined edge of the old outer court, and in your mind you see the palace rising up around you, the black and white timber, the symmetrical towers, the imported artists sculpting plaster while probably asking each other if this king always changed his mind this much. That's the thing about Nonsuch. It was never really finished. Henry kept tinkering, adjusting, adding, removing, because apparently micromanaging was his preferred form of cardio. The wind shifts, brushing your neck, and for a heartbeat you feel as if the walls materialize. You walk alongside a corridor you can't see but somehow sense, the way people sometimes swear they can feel the outline of an amputated limb. You picture courtiers bustling through doorways with their hands full of scrolls and gossip. Maybe someone whispers about Anne of Cleves visiting after the divorce, or about Catherine Parr's latest attempt to keep Henry calm during yet another bout of royal sulking. It all blends into a soft murmur that rides the cool air. A quirky historical tidbit floats into your mind, the kind historians politely raise an eyebrow over. Some reports claim that Nonsuch had a dedicated space where Henry displayed bizarre imported curiosities, shells, odd stones, possible taxidermied creatures, and one rumor suggests he had a mermaid's tail that was almost certainly the back half of a poor unfortunate fish sewn to a monkey torso. Because of course someone in Tudor England thought that was a good idea. You half expect to trip over a scale or a tuft of faux mermaid fur still stuck in the soil. You wander past the imaginary privy gardens, where the herbal scents are long gone, replaced by damp earth and a faint smell like wet nettle. Historians still argue whether Henry intended these gardens to rival Italian Renaissance landscapes, or whether the design was a chaotic mashup of whatever trend caught his eye that month. Sketches suggest geometric knots, carved fountains, and expensive imported plants. But we only know bits and pieces, like someone tore out pages from a diary and used them to light a fireplace. You pause where the great hall once stretched, its gigantic timber roof vaulting overhead, except it is. It's just sky, pale and stirred with stars. You tilt your head back, imagining the chandeliers, the bustle of servants scrambling to keep up with feasts that probably violated the recommended caloric intake for a small village. For a moment you swear you hear lute strings, or it could just be your stomach reminding you that you haven't eaten. Hard to say. A soft crunch pulls your attention down. Your boot has sunk into a shallow depression that might have been part of a cellar or storage area. You crouch, brushing your hand across the cold soil. Beneath this spot, somewhere deep in the layers of centuries, archaeologists have found tile fragments, blue, white, red glazes meant to impress foreign visitors. You imagine Henry VIII standing in this very place, tapping a tile with the tip of his cane and warning the builders he wanted grandeur, brighter, more magnificent. He wasn't subtle. Then comes the part of Nonsuch's story that always hits like a weird plot twist. After Henry's death, the palace eventually ended up in the hands of Barbara Villiers, mistress of Charles II, who decided she needed fast cash. Time for a controversial renovation. No, time to demolish the entire palace and sell it piece by piece. It's like someone taking the Mona Lisa and cutting it into coasters. You walk past where the north wing once stood, imagining men with chisels and saws prying apart Henry's vanity brick by brick, loading cart after cart with materials that would go on to build ordinary houses. Imagine living in a cottage that secretly contains a fragment of royal grandeur behind the wallpaper. You kind of hope the owners never removed it during renovations. You keep walking, and the Phantom Palace rearranges around you. The Privy Council chambers vanish, the audience hall fades like a dissolving photograph, and soon all that remains is the sound of the grass brushing your ankles. There's something beautifully absurd about the whole thing, this monumental structure built to proclaim power and permanence, erased by financial inconvenience. You can't help thinking Henry would have lost his royal mind if he knew. The night thickens, cool and serene, and the only illumination comes from a sliver of moon weaving through the clouds like a shy lantern bearer. As you approach the outline of where the inner court once stood, you feel a strange calm. Maybe it's the softness of surviving nothingness, Or maybe it's the comfort of knowing not everything grand has to endure. Sometimes it's enough that people remember, or at least try to. A faint hum begins, wind, insects, or perhaps the palace exhaling its last remembered song. You breathe it in, letting the air cool your chest. You don't need walls or towers to feel the magnitude of what once lived here. You just need night, grass, and the awareness that history's footprints don't disappear. They simply soften. Somewhere behind you, a dog barks, snapping the spell. The fox from earlier trots past, clearly unimpressed with your sentimental reflection. You give it a little nod, the universal sign of yes, I get it, I'm being dramatic, and push onward, leaving Nonsuch to sleep under its blanket of stars. You don't look back, you don't have to. You head west, the night settling around your shoulders like a warm cloak despite the crisp bite threading through the breeze. The Thames drifts off somewhere behind you, murmuring in the dark, but you're following an older instinct now, toward the hills, toward something grand that shouldn't be forgotten. The ground rises gently, and soon the outline of Woking Palace begins to take shape, not in brick and beam, because most of that is long gone, but in the way the shadows fall and the way your footsteps suddenly feel too loud, as if the grass remembers when this was royal territory. Woking isn't one of the flashy palaces. It's not Hampton Court or Greenwich with their look at me, I'm dripping with prestige facades. Woking feels quieter, more personal, like Henry VIII didn't just rule here, he lived here. And as you step through what used to be the outer gateway, you sense that immediacy, that closeness. The night wraps around the space like it's guarding old secrets. Your boots brush through the dew-laced reeds edging what was once the moat. The water now sits stagnant in places, reflecting the stars like cracked shards of glass. You can almost picture barges gliding up the channels, delivering supplies, letters, gossip, especially gossip. Tudor courtiers loved drama the way you secretly love scrolling through comment sections you know will ruin your mood. A mainstream historical fact surfaces gently in your mind. Woking Palace began as a medieval manor before being transformed into a royal residence under Henry VIII, and Henry VIII expanded it further, adding chambers, rebuilding the Great Hall, and reinforcing the moat. He visited regularly during the early years of his reign, especially when traveling between London and the southwest. It wasn't a show palace. It was a functioning, well-used home base for hunting, business, and whatever passed for romantic relaxation between political crises. You step into the huge area that once held the Great Hall. The stars hang above like a scattered choir, and for a second the roar of the space fills with life. Servants carrying trenchers of roasted meat, hounds weaving between legs, musicians testing their strings, and Henry seated at the dais with a look that probably meant something like I am both hungry and important. Bring me more of both. The scent of spiced wine sneaks through your imagination, warm and comforting. You take another slow step, letting your fingers graze the low remains of brickwork. It's rough, uneven, and warm from the day's sun. For a moment, you swear it pulses like a heartbeat. The palace may be in ruins, but it isn't dead, it's sleeping. A quirky tidbit nudges your mind. Some local legends claim that Woking had a secret tunnel leading into the surrounding woodland, so Henry could slip away unnoticed for early morning hunts. Scholars today roll their eyes at that, but the rumor persists. You glance at the earth near your feet, half expecting a hidden door to swing open and reveal century-old cobwebs and a fox who definitely doesn't pay rent. As you walk deeper into the compound, the air grows warmer, as if the night here has chosen to linger in a different season. Your shoulders relax without you meaning to. You follow a faint indentation in the grass, imagining it as the trace of a long-gone corridor. The moonlight paints the shape of your shadow as if you're walking down a real hallway, pulling you forward. Walking wasn't lavish, but it was intimate. That much you feel in each step. You imagine Catherine of Aragon walking the galleries here during the early years of her marriage to Henry before everything unraveled. Maybe she enjoyed the quiet of Woking, the orchards, the riverbank, the thick woodlands where birds chattered endlessly. Maybe, just maybe, she felt a little at peace before the tides of royal politics turned stormy. Historians still argue whether Henry intended to fully rebuild Woking into a more modern palace before abandoning the idea for shinier projects like Nonsuch. The debates get heated, in the scholarly sense of heated, meaning everyone writes politely annoyed footnotes about each other. You picture a table full of experts, all drinking tea aggressively while defending their theories about a construction schedule that ended 5 centuries ago. It's charming, in a please stop emailing each other way. You drift toward the spot where the royal chambers once stood. Your breath fogs faintly, even though the night isn't particularly cold. It feels like the air here has been holding its breath for centuries, waiting for someone to notice the outline of vanished walls. You imagine Henry packing inside, not as the tyrant history class version of him, but as the younger, athletic king who still believed he could shape England exactly the way he wanted. Maybe he practiced speeches here, talking to himself in the mirror. Maybe he sulked when a hunting trip went wrong. Maybe he laughed at something stupid a friend said. Wandering through ruins always reminds you that history wasn't just momentous, it was ordinary too. The grass whispers as you push onward, moving into a smaller area that once held kitchens and storerooms. You smell earth, damp and metallic. If you close your eyes, you can conjure the aroma of boiling broth, roasting venison, freshly baked bread. Your stomach makes a noise that is definitely not as majestic as the imagined feast. A mouse skitters across a fallen stone, the soft tick-tick of its feet barely audible. Somewhere nearby, an owl gives a low, bored-sounding hoot. Maybe it's seen too many night wanderers and is unimpressed. You hoot back softly because you're absolutely that kind of person now. There is a beat of silence, then another hoot. Congratulations, you just made an owl friend. You step around a cluster of ivy and spot what remains of the moat's inner wall. The bricks reflect the moonlight with a faint sheen, as though polished by the weight of vanished hands. You lean down and touch one. It's cool, older than you can fathom. You wonder how many people touched this same stone. Monarchs, servants, builders, children, messengers. Highborn and lowborn, all leaving fingerprints in the same place. Then comes the question that always stirs in old places like this. Why did it fall out of royal favor? The answer isn't dramatic. No battles, no disasters, just shifting tastes, new palaces rising, old ones left behind. Henry lost interest. His children didn't reclaim it. Time did the rest. You slowly circle what might have been the inner courtyard, the stars drifting above like lanterns left behind by absent courtiers. There's a peacefulness here, so quiet you can hear the rush of your own heartbeat. Maybe that's why you feel strangely safe. Even though you're walking through a skeleton palace in the dark, the land radiates a gentleness, like it remembers hospitality. The ruined foundations form broken lines in the grass, geometric enough that you can still map them. You pause in the center, letting the night fold around you. Woking was never meant to impress foreign dignitaries. It wasn't built as a monument. It was simply lived in. And somehow, that makes it feel more human than the grander palaces ever could. A moth flutters past your cheek, brushing you with tiny wings. You whisper an apology because that's just your life now, talking to insects in Tudor ruins. But honestly, it feels right. As you leave the palace grounds, you cast one last look over your shoulder. Not because you're scared, but because something about Woking deserves a moment of acknowledgement. A nod to the quieter corners of history. The soft places that mattered not because they were spectacular, but because they held the real rhythms of life. You breathe out slow and warm. And then you keep walking. You follow the curve of an old country lane, the night deepening into something velvety and quiet, the kind of darkness that makes your footsteps sound like they belong to someone else. Ahead, a cluster of trees forms a jagged crown against the moonlit sky. Their silhouettes guide you toward a place half swallowed by time, a place people tend to forget unless they're the kind who read footnotes for fun. You're approaching Otford Palace, once a glittering jewel of the Tudor landscape and now. Well, now it's more of a patient ghost, waiting politely for visitors. The air shifts as you enter what used to be the outer precinct. You feel it immediately, a subtle pressure, the kind of awareness that settles on your shoulders when a location still remembers being important. Your boots brush through damp grass, and you swear the ground hums faintly. Not in a creepy, you're being absorbed by the earth, way more like a place clearing its throat after centuries of silence. Otford was never Henry's personal playground the way Nonsuch was, but it was grand. Properly, intimidatingly grand. And the irony is that it wasn't even built by him. It came from the powerful archbishops of Canterbury, whose wealth and influence were already legendary. By the time Henry VIII got involved, this palace was so luxurious that it made even royal residences look like starter homes. Naturally, Henry took one look and said, "Mine now." Because why settle for a palace when you can take a churchman's palace and assert dominance at the same time? A mainstream historical fact unfolds in your thoughts. Otford Palace was one of the largest and most splendid residences of the Archbishop of Canterbury, rebuilt under Archbishop William Warham around 1515. Its size and magnificence were significant enough that, after the break with Rome, Henry VIII seized it, because nothing says, "I'm the undisputed head of the church now," like helping yourself to the Archbishop's favorite house. You walk along the outline of the original Great Court, which in its prime stretched so wide your current footsteps would barely cover a fraction of it. The remaining fragments of the northwest tower rise in the moonlight, a jagged, weathered sentinel that still refuses to fall. You reach out and touch the stone. It's cool, rough, and very much alive in the way ruins sometimes are, quietly stubborn after centuries of being ignored. You circle around its base trying to imagine the full structure. Hundreds of windows, high roofs glinting in sunlight, courtiers bustling between chambers, servants rushing to prepare feasts, and somewhere in the chaos, Henry VIII striding through the galleries like he owned the place, which, to be fair, he did. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of wet leaves and something that almost resembles old wood smoke. Your imagination fills in the rest. The smell of roasting venison, beeswax candles, the slightly sweaty aroma of too many people wearing rich fabrics in a confined space. Tudor life wasn't exactly subtle. A quirky tidbit slips into your memory, one of those details historians mention only when they're feeling playful. Some local legends claim that Otford had a whispering gallery effect in one of its wings, a spot where conversations carried strangely far along the plastered walls. Whether it was a deliberate architectural design or just a convenient flaw, nobody can say for sure. But it meant that in certain corners, your secrets were only as safe as the nearest bored servant pretending not to listen. You imagine Henry finding this out and suddenly becoming very conscious of who might overhear him complaining about gout again. You tread deeper into the ruins, your shadow stretching long across the grass. The moon swings low, casting a silvery glow that makes the stone fragments glimmer. It's peaceful, almost serene, the kind of place where even your thoughts seem to lower their volume. You pass what was once the Archbishop's private garden. Nothing remains but soft earth, wild nettles, and the occasional brave flower poking through, as if trying to audition for a spot in the long-gone Tudor beds. You picture Warham walking through the garden in deep contemplation, robes sweeping over the gravel, maybe rehearsing a diplomatic speech he hoped Henry would like. Spoiler: Henry rarely liked anything unless it was about him. The palace was enormous, so enormous that historians still argue whether it rivaled Hampton Court in size. Some scholars insist it absolutely did, while others argue that comparing them is like comparing a luxury villa to a small city. The debate is ongoing, politely heated, and occasionally petty in that charming academic way where someone footnotes a disagreement with. This interpretation is imaginative but unsupported. You chuckle softly. Academics fight with italics and sarcasm. You step into the remains of the Great Hall, where a few lonely stones still sketch a ghostly outline. The air is cooler here, as if the hall itself exhaled. You close your eyes and let the imagined echoes come, The murmur of voices, the clatter of trenchers, the shuffle of boots, and the reverberation of musicians warming up with a few tentative notes. The space expands around you, vibrant and full. And because your brain is exactly the chaotic place it is, you also imagine some hapless servant tripping while carrying a stack of pewter plates. The clang probably echoed across the hall. Maybe the archbishop winced. Maybe Henry snapped at someone. Court life was many things. Quiet was rarely one of them. You meander toward the far side of the court, where the kitchens once sprawled. The scent of earth is heavier here, rich and grounding. You kneel and brush your fingers along a line of old bricks half buried in the soil. Generations of roots have nudged them out of alignment, nature untidying what Tudor masons once laid so precisely. Otford never quite became the beloved Tudor hotspot. After Henry seized it, the palace slipped in and out of royal favor, overshadowed by the shinier, newer, or better-located residences. Henry visited a few times, especially early on when the symbolism of owning it was still fresh. But eventually he drifted elsewhere. Monarchs are fickle, palaces even more so. You rise and approach a section of wall that still stands stubbornly against the stars. Its height is surprising, not towering, but tall enough to remind you this place once demanded respect. You rest your palm against it again, wondering how many hands touched the same surface. Archbishops, carpenters, scribes, cooks, stable boys, Henry himself. The night deepens further, shadows stretching into long fingers. A soft rustle makes you turn. A deer watches you from the tree line, ears swiveling, body motionless except for the slight tilt of its head. It blinks at you as if asking what you're doing wandering royal ruins at this hour. You blink back, fully aware you're having a starring contest with wildlife again. Eventually, the deer snorts, unimpressed, and steps away. You can't help whispering, "Rude." The deer pretends not to hear you. You wander toward the moat, now more of a ditch, its water long gone except after heavy rains. The moonlight reflects faintly in puddles scattered along its length. You imagine the palace in its prime, the water carefully controlled, shimmering under lantern light, swans drifting across the surface like pampered aristocrats. Now it's quiet, overgrown, softened. You keep walking, letting the palace dissolve behind you as the night air grows gentler. Otford may be mostly forgotten, but its presence lingers in the soil, the stones, the quiet spaces between tree roots. History doesn't need grandeur to survive. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to walk and listen. You glance once more at the surviving tower, proud and ragged in the moonlight. It stands alone but not defeated, a stubborn monument to a palace too big for its own era, too political for comfort, too important to vanish completely. You give it a small nod, the kind given to old warriors or tired storytellers. Then you turn back to the path, your journey still stretching forward into the soft, starlit dark. The path bends south, dipping into a quieter stretch of countryside where the night grows warmer, and the silence takes on a strangely expectant quality, as if the land itself knows you're about to step into one of the Tudor world's most restless fragments. Thorny undergrowth crowds the edges of the trail, snagging at your sleeves like overexcited museum docents who desperately want you to look at something important. And then, as the trees thin and the moon spills its pale sheen over open ground, you reach the scattered remains of Havering Palace, a place that once mattered so much and now barely whispers its name. You step into the clearing and the air shifts immediately, lighter, almost mischievous. Havering never had the intimidating presence of Henry VII's improvements at Hampton Court or the flamboyance of Nonsuch. Instead, it lived in the margins, a site used for retreats, negotiations, quiet recoveries, and moments when monarchs needed to disappear from the chaos without technically leaving court. It wasn't flashy, but it was familiar, comfortable. A royal haven hidden right on the edges of London's reach. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind. Havering Palace dates back to Saxon times and served as a royal residence for centuries before Henry VIII inherited it. By the Tudor period, It was already old, really old, yet still important enough that Henry stayed here when he needed proximity to London without the noise, sickness, and political circus of the capital. Think of it as the Tudor equivalent of a getaway heirloom with surprisingly strong symbolic value. Your boots sink gently into the soft soil, and even though most of the palace is long gone, you can feel its footprint. The layout ghosts around you, the great hall stretching across the center, chambers fanning outward like the spokes of a delicate wheel, service buildings hugging the edges. In the moonlight, the foundations seem to pulse faintly, remembering every footstep of kings, queens, servants, diplomats, and the occasional unfortunate messenger who probably wished he'd chosen a different career. You make your way toward a low mound where part of the hall once stood. The grass sways in a breeze that shouldn't exist because the night was still just moments ago. It's as if the hall exhales, tired, old, but still proud. You touch the earth with your fingertips, cold and grainy, and imagine the timbered roof soaring above your head, the long tables stretching endlessly, candles spilling warm light over Tudor faces. Henry VIII used havering in the early years of his reign as an escape from the relentless churn of court life. You can almost see the younger Henry here, broad-shouldered, energetic, still hopeful about the trajectory of his dynasty, still capable of both athletic feats and genuine charm before the decades chipped away at his patience and his ankles. You picture him striding across the hall, barking cheerful orders, maybe teasing a courtier, maybe challenging someone to a late-night card game he absolutely intended to win. A quirky tidbit nudges into your mind. There were persistent rumors, very persistent, that Havering was haunted by a spectral figure known as the Man in Grey. Not the Man in Grey from London theatre lore. This one was described as tall, silent, and fond of walking through closed doors. Some early modern sources swear he was seen near the old chapel. Others claim he paced the gallery during stormy nights, possibly judging everyone's sleeping posture. You glance around, half hopping, half horrified that the Man in Grey will show up. Nothing. Just you, the moon, and a particularly judgmental crow perched on a branch. The breeze carries the scent of moss, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. You drift toward the area where the chapel once stood, just a shallow depression now, ringed by stubborn nettles that clearly haven't accepted the concept of 5 centuries later. You pause and close your eyes. In your mind, you hear the soft mutter of prayers, the rustle of cloth, the coughing of someone who probably shouldn't have been at court during flu season. You let the imagined sound settle before opening your eyes again to the quiet modern night. Historians still argue whether Henry intended to rebuild Havering more extensively. Some claim he had plans to update the aging buildings, modernize the apartments, and reinforce the structure. But others believe he saw it as serviceable enough and directed his resources elsewhere. The debate is ongoing, mostly because Henry left behind enough unfinished architectural dreams to keep scholars busy forever. You imagine them waving papers at each other at conferences, speaking politely, but absolutely dying inside. You walk farther into the ruins, stepping over a broken brick half swallowed by the earth. Every fragment glints faintly in the moonlight, as if remembering the glow of hearth fires. Havering may not have been glamorous, but it pulsed with life. Hunts beginning at dawn, quiet political discussions at dusk, royal meals that were oddly more relaxed here than anywhere else. You imagine the sound of laughter echoing off timbered beams, unexpected, unguarded, the kind of laughter that's impossible in grander palaces. The clearing narrows as you approach what was once the royal lodging. The night air warms suddenly, brushing your cheek like someone passed behind you. You turn, nothing but wind teasing a clump of tall grass. You exhale slowly, telling yourself not to start narrating a personal horror movie. This is bedtime history, not bedtime panic. Still, Havering has a way of making you feel watched. Not in a sinister sense, more like the land is curious, wondering why someone finally came to listen. You whisper a quiet hello, and the grass answers with a swish that you generously interpret as polite acknowledgement. As you wander toward the former kitchen yard, the soil changes underfoot, firmer, more compacted. Centuries of activity condense the earth here into something dense and unmoving. You imagine the clatter of pots, the roar of fires, the shouts of cooks who never got enough sleep but produced meals fit for royalty anyway. Your stomach grumbles loudly enough to qualify as a minor haunting. You pat it apologetically. A fox darts past, tail flashing like a brushstroke of silver. It pauses, stares at you with clear suspicion, because apparently you give off might steal snacks energy and then disappears into the undergrowth. You sigh. Even the wildlife here is judging you tonight. You circle back toward the center of the old palace grounds, the moon unfurling a gentle glow over everything. The ruins feel softer now, less like abandoned fragments and more like memories settling into place. Havering wasn't built to impress, it was built to serve. And in its quiet way, it did. It sheltered monarchs, soothed tempers, held secrets, and provided refuge when London became too loud. You breathe in deeply, letting the night air settle warm in your chest. There's a peace here, unexpected, deep, a softness that wraps around you as if the palace is glad you came. You blink slowly, the world around you blurred by moonlight and memory. And then you walk on, toward the next forgotten place, waiting in the dark. You move through the night with a gentle, steady rhythm in your step, the kind of rhythm that comes from getting a little too comfortable strolling through centuries like they're soft pillows. The path swings you back toward the Thames again, its moonlit surface fluttering like a restless silver blanket. But this time the river feels different, wider, quieter, almost watchful, because ahead of you lies a place that everyone thinks they know, a palace so famous it practically has its own celebrity fan base. And yet, you're not going where the crowds go. You're slipping into the hidden pieces, the amputated limbs, the half-forgotten corners of Hampton Court Palace, the parts most tourists never imagine, the edges history keeps like a secret drawer. The great surviving palace looms across the water, its red brick towers and chimneys standing proud in the moonlight. But you're not heading for those showy walls. You veer toward the shadows where other walls used to be, where demolished galleries once stretched like long ribs along the riverbank, where towers now long gone used to shoulder the skyline before Henry VIII reshaped the place to suit whichever version of himself he was performing that week. Your boots fall softly on the grass as you cross into a darker, quieter zone, the lost northern courts. To most visitors, Hampton Court begins and ends with the Tudor gateway, the clock court, the kitchens, all the preserved, curated glory. But once upon a time, the palace sprawled even farther. You step forward, and the earth subtly changes underfoot, flattening into spaces that make too much geometric sense to be accidental. The moon lights the faintest of raised lines, soil remembering the long-gone ranges that used to box these courtyards in. A light breeze brushes your cheek, warmer than before. You swear it carries a hint of roasted meat, maybe illusionary Tudor kitchen smoke drifting from another century. That would make sense. You're not far from where an entire service range once stood, demolished in the 17th century when later monarchs decided Henry's layout was a bit too Henry. One mainstream fact historians highlight: Hampton Court once held nearly 1,000 rooms, many now long vanished. Only a fraction survives today, which is wild when you realize the place still feels enormous. You let the shadows guide you north, where the lost tower once dominated the skyline. Henry's early builders had created a tall, imposing structure that gave sweeping views of the river. Now it's just a patch of grass and a feeling, an upward tug in the air, like the ghost of vertical ambition. You tilt your head back, imagining the tower rising above you. The night unravels upward into darkness, and for a moment you're convinced you see brickwork where only sky exists. A soft rustle brushes behind you. You spin, heart doing that little jump scare jig, but it's only the wind flicking through reeds. Completely normal. Absolutely not a phantom guard checking if you have a security pass. You wander closer to the river, where a long, invisible line once marked the Tudor River Gallery, a narrow, enclosed walkway stretching along the bank. You imagine stepping into its wooden frame. The floorboards creak under your weight. Candle sconces flicker along the walls, throwing gold light on carved beams overhead. This was the kind of place where Henry might have walked while pondering statecraft, digestion, or which minister he was currently suspicious of. You walk the length of the vanished gallery, your feet whispering in the grass as though the boards are still there. The river laps in a soft, soothing rhythm, almost matching your breathing. Here's your quirky tidbit for the section. Some early sketches suggest the gallery had unusually narrow windows, too cramped for comfortable viewing, but strategically perfect for keeping winter drafts out. Imagine constructing a long, scenic riverside corridor, and then deciding windows were optional. Very Tudor minimalism, or Tudor maximum paranoia about colds. You reach a break in the invisible wall, the spot where a small turret once jutted outward. Its foundations are gone, erased when William and Mary rebuilt portions of the palace in their Baroque makeover. But the air still feels angled here, as though corners remain even without walls. You pause and rest a hand on the empty space where warm brick would have met your palm. The night suddenly deepens around you, gathering like folds of fabric. You've stepped into the footprint of the old Queen's Cloister, a covered walkway that once connected Henry's apartments to the Privy Gardens. The surviving cloister on the other side of the palace gets all the spotlight while this one lies forgotten, its stones recycled or lost to time. You stand perfectly still, listening. Footsteps seem to echo softly, your imagination supplying the shuffle of gowns, the murmur of ladies in waiting, the occasional sharp whisper of courtly intrigue. Historians still argue whether this cloister was used more for everyday domestic movement or as a discreet path for private royal meetings. You picture Henry striding through, cloak swinging, muttering about paperwork, or maybe slipping away from some particularly long diplomatic event. You can almost see him passing you right now, his phantom outline brushing your sleeve as he pushes onward toward the Privy Garden. You murmur a quiet apology for existing in his walkway. You move toward the garden's edge, where a forgotten set of steps once descended, a private exit Henry reportedly used during the early years of his reign. The steps are long gone now, but the ground slopes just slightly, holding the memory. You descend the air steps carefully, which feels ridiculous but also absolutely correct. At the bottom, you pause and breathe in the scent of damp earth and old roses. The garden once stretched wide here, full of symbolic knots and patterned flower beds that scream Tudor aesthetic. Look, how orderly everything is because I say so. You walk deeper until the darkness feels more intimate, the air warming slightly as though history is hugging you, gently, politely. Nothing haunt why you drift into the lost orchard, removed centuries ago. Moonlight threads through imaginary branches as you walk. Fruit trees once stretched in neat ranks. Their blossoms would have perfumed the spring air around Henry's private lodgings. A soft petal brushes your cheek. Nothing is blooming tonight, but your imagination is on a roll, and frankly, it's doing beautiful work. Another breeze rolls in, carrying faint music. Maybe a distant party, maybe a trick of acoustics, maybe your brain replaying something from an earlier section. Hampton Court sees thousands of visitors daily, yet in this corner, you feel absolutely alone. Peacefully alone, the good kind, not the horror movie. Something is watching you kind. The palace's forgotten parts seem to hold only gentleness now. You circle toward the edge of the great Tudor kitchen complex. Everyone knows the main kitchens still stand, roaring with reenactments by day. But you're in the territory of the demolished service passages, the ones that once ran beneath the visible rooms like secret arteries. Some historians believe tunnels connected to storage areas farther north, though others argue the evidence is too fragmentary. You walk where those passages likely twisted underground, feeling warmth radiate up from your imagination of giant hearths, cauldrons bubbling, spit boys rotating huge skewers of meat until their arms were definitely ready to sue for workplace compensation. Your foot brushes something solid. You look down, a chunk of old brick half buried, probably from 18th or 19th century landscaping, but your brain immediately claims it as Tudor. You kneel, run your fingers over its rough face, and place it back with exaggerated reverence. You're not repeating your earlier, potentially smuggling historical tiles crime. The night tilts toward calm as you near the demolished banqueting house once attached to the palace's eastern side. Henry built multiple versions of these party halls across his estates. Only later constructions survive. But this one, the small early Tudor version, is gone. You step into its footprint. The moon lights an invisible square around you. You imagine tables laden with sugared dishes, musicians playing lutes, Henry making loud pronouncements while courtiers laughed a half-second too late to seem natural. Something shifts above you, just the clouds, moving gently across the moon. But the moment they pass, the space brightens again, and for a heartbeat, the whole lost banqueting house seems to glow in your mind, complete and alive, its walls vibrating with noise and warmth. Then the illusion fades. Only the soft night remains. You walk back toward the heart of the lost courts, following the perimeter where once the Tiltyard Tower stood. It's long vanished, but its presence presses upward from the ground like a remembered spine. From here, Henry once watched jousts, feasts, and demonstrations of loyalty. The tower was demolished when later monarchs had different plans, because nothing stays sacred for long in a palace full of powerful people. The air hums softly around you. The river whispers beyond the trees. Grass brushes your ankles. All of Hampton Court feels like it's breathing with you, sharing its forgotten edges, letting you borrow its secret half-lives. And when you finally step out of the last vanished courtyard, you feel the palace settle behind you in the darkness. Older, richer, calmer for having been seen again. You push deeper across Nonsuch's ghostly footprint, and the air feels charged, as if the ground itself is trying to remember something it forgot centuries ago. The earth here is flatter, strangely deliberate, a geometry only visible if you squint, the faint, lingering stamp of a vanished palace that once screamed royal magnificence. You move slowly, brushing aside a tuft of grass with your shoe, half expecting gold leaf to glitter up at you. And honestly, given the things that have survived Henry's era, like that time people swore powdered unicorn horn cured poisoning, you wouldn't be surprised if a stray mosaic tile decided to appear out of nowhere tonight. The moonlight stretches long across the meadows, turning everything into pale parchment. On this blank page, Henry VIII once painted his loudest brag, Nonsuch Palace, a residence so ornate it practically posed for its own royal portrait. You step forward as if wadding into memory, feeling the odd tension of a place that used to be louder than life and is now quieter than sleep. The scent of damp soil rises, earthy and grounding, as your feet trace the faint boundaries of a courtyard the size of your entire neighborhood. You imagine stone walls rising around you, every inch carved with mythic reliefs, gods, monsters, abstract allegories of power, the sort of visuals that would make even modern graphic designers scream into their coffee mugs. A mainstream fact hums beneath your steps. Nonsuch truly was one of the greatest artistic endeavors of its century, a palace built not for living but for dazzling, competing, proclaiming. It wasn't just architecture, it was propaganda in 3 dimensions. You pause where the great gatehouse once stood, picturing its gilded statues peering down like judgmental cousins at a family reunion. Historians still argue whether Henry intended Nonsuch to rival Francis I's Shade-out a Chambord, you whisper to yourself, the idea curling through the cold air like smoke. But honestly, if you're Henry VIII, why build a palace unless it's going to smack your rivals right across the ego? Your hand trails through empty space, fingertips tingling with the phantom texture of elaborate stucco. The artisans imported for this work came from across Europe, Italian masters, Flemish carvers, French metalworkers, a whole Avengers lineup of Renaissance craftsmanship. And here you are, centuries later, listening to the wind whistle through nothing but grass and memory. That's the thing about walking through forgotten royal footprints. Your brain keeps building the walls back up as fast as time tore them down. You drift toward the heart of where the Privy Garden once bloomed. Even now, the land has a strangely curated neatness, as if the garden ghost refuses to let itself go ragged. In your mind, hedges rise high and crisply trimmed, fountains sparkle, and colored glass glints from imported Italian tiles. A fringe tidbit wiggles up from the historical margins. Some swore the garden contained a secret chamber beneath one of its terraces, a tiny hideaway meant for either quiet contemplation or discreet flirting, because Henry's court really never did half measures on anything. Tonight, all you hear is the soft shuffle of your own steps and the distant murmur of nocturnal creatures who have claimed the palace's silence as their own. You chuckle softly, somewhere. An owl probably thinks it inherited an empire. You angle left, climbing a gentle rise that once supported the Privy Apartments, the place where Henry would have lounged, plotted, eaten, sulked, and occasionally pretended he wasn't moments away from reshuffling his political alliances like a frantic blackjack player. The darkness here feels denser, as if the past pressed itself thicker in this spot. You can almost sense the echoes of velvet drapes, the thud of boots, the clink of goblets raised in courtly games of who can be most flattering without bursting into flames. Your foot sinks slightly into softer earth. Beneath you lie fragments of demolition debris, bits of brick and plaster buried deep when Nonsuch was torn down in the 17th century. People often forget that the palace didn't simply crumble. It was demolished piece by piece, sold off, traded, reused like the world's fanciest recycling project. Somewhere out there, in some quiet English manor, a fireplace might still glow with stones once touched by Henry VII's decorators. Talk about historical thrift shopping. A breeze picks up and slides cold fingers across your neck. For a moment, the rustling grass almost mimics murmurs, soft, unintelligible, but layered with the sort of courtly tension that would make any sane person fake a sudden appointment elsewhere. You take a slow breath, grounding yourself. The dark can play tricks, but the trick you want tonight is imagination, not panic. You walk deliberately toward the center of what scholars believe was the inner courtyard, where courtiers once gathered like glittering gossip moths around the brightest flame of power. Your steps fall in a rhythm that aligns with the stone pattern that once lay beneath you. The mind fills in missing lines the way you fill in a half-heard lyric. It's comforting, like your brain is helping the place rebuild itself just long enough for you to wander through. Above you, the stars glint like fragments of Henry's original gold-leafed cornices. You look up, half expecting to see the carved figures that supposedly line the walls. Heraldic beasts snarling proudly from pedestals, allegorical women draped in flowing robes symbolizing virtues the court rarely practiced, and a portrait of Henry himself posed with the subtlety of a man declaring, "You're welcome, world." You snort softly at the image. "Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen," you murmur, because if ancient beauty routines could survive in collective memory, why not entire carved panels of Tudor braggadocio? The ground flattens again as you cross into the space that once held the banqueting hall. You can almost smell roasted spices, hear laughter echoing off high-timbered ceilings, sense the warm glow of candlelight. Yet all of it collapses as fast as it forms, replaced by the cool whisper of wind. You tug your jacket tighter, appreciating how this palace, even in ruin, still knows how to stage a dramatic dissolve. A fox darts across your path, stops, stares at you like you're trespassing on its private estate, then trots off with the offended dignity of minor nobility. You bow slightly, because Nonsuch deserves at least one bow tonight, even if it's directed at wildlife. You wander toward the perimeter where the tilt-yard would have stretched long and straight, a place for jousts, showmanship, and proving one's worth with a lance instead of a LinkedIn profile. You imagine the thud of hooves, the crack of wood, the cheers of onlookers, and Henry's booming laugh echoing through it all. Now, only your heartbeat fills the silence, steady and soft. You breathe deeply, letting the cool night settle into your muscles. Nonsuch may be gone, but walking through its absence feels oddly intimate, like reading someone's diary after the pages have faded. You aren't looking at history, you're walking inside what it left behind. And as you turn slowly in the silver-blue darkness, you feel the weight of this place's forgotten grandeur settle into you, a quiet reminder that even the loudest monuments can vanish, but the stories remain, waiting for someone like you to trace their outlines in the night. You step lightly from the memory of Nonsuch and into darkness again, letting the night swallow the last glimmers of its phantom walls. The path ahead feels softer, looser, almost hesitant, as though the earth knows you're crossing into a place that even historians tilt their heads about. Whitehall once sprawled across what is now bustling London, but tonight you tread the ghost layer beneath the city's noise. It's late enough that the streets above you have quieted, leaving only the faint hum of distant traffic, like a futuristic echo layered over Tudor secrets. You let the silence pull you further in. Your steps slow as you visualize the palace that once crowned this ground, sprawling, chaotic, endlessly enlarged, like Henry VIII kept adding extensions every time he got bored. And honestly, given his personality, he probably did. A mainstream fact slides easily into your thoughts. Whitehall was the largest palace in Europe at one point, a labyrinth of halls, chambers, courtyards, and galleries. A city within a city, stuffed with courtiers too terrified to blink without checking whether blinking was currently in political fashion. You imagine crossing under the vanished Holbein Gate, once the palace's proud, distinctive entry. The air feels heavier here, the kind of thickness that comes from too many layers of history pressing down like overstuffed blankets. Shadows stretch outward where archways should be, framing doorways that no longer exist except in the space between footsteps. You walk forward, half expecting a carved wooden beam to materialize above you. No luck. Just you, the night, and that one brave mosquito who has decided your face is its destiny. The ground tilts gently, guiding you into where the great tiltyard once opened, a long, muscular stretch of land where Henry jousted with enough enthusiasm to worry everyone around him. You can almost hear the metallic heartbeat of armor, the thunder of hooves. Historians still argue whether Henry's later leg injury came from his last tilt here. You murmur to yourself, picturing the infamous fall that rewired his personality into something darker, moodier, and significantly more dangerous to be married to. A breeze sweeps through and brushes your sleeves, reminding you that no horses charge here anymore, no banners snap, no crowd breathes in collective awe. Just the faint scent of cold concrete and night air. You smile anyway. Your imagination can fill in the missing bits. It's like a mental projector. Insert Tudor drama, press play. You drift toward where the Privy Garden once bloomed, smaller than others, but trimmed and arranged with exacting precision. Roses, herbs, trellises, carefully sculpted hedges. The whole place designed less for relaxation and more for theatrically bumping into people you wanted to impress. A fringe tidbit bubbles up. Some accounts suggest that one corner of the garden included a discreet walkway where Henry held private conversations, not quite secret, but secret enough for Tudor standards, which is basically like whispering in a crowded elevator and hopping no one notices. Tonight, though, the only thing whispering is the wind. It ripples through the phantom hedges, and you feel a soft shiver run along your spine. Not fear, just the quiet awareness that thousands of footsteps once wore this ground smooth, and now yours tread lightly on top of theirs. You press deeper into the imagined maze of chambers. The palace was famously confusing. Even courtiers got lost. You, however, move with slow confidence, weaving through the invisible corridors like you've been here before in another life. Your shoes tap softly across a wide patch where the banqueting house should stand. Unlike the rest of Whitehall, the real banqueting house still exists, its ceiling painted in all its dramatic glory. But these footprints you're walking belong to its predecessors, older wooden halls filled with pageantry, masks, elaborate theatrical performances, and the kind of costume budgets that would horrify modern accountants. You pause, inhaling the faintest hint of London's nighttime air. Cars in the distance, a late passerby's footsteps overhead, faint bass thumping from some brave nightclub. Yet beneath all of it, you swear you feel warmth, old warmth clinging to the earth. The kind that comes from torches and too many bodies crammed into a party, the smell of roasted meat, spiced wine, perfume strong enough to stun a small mammal. You let the ghost of that warmth settle around your shoulders like a cloak. A soft laugh escapes you. "Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen," you whisper. Because if people once believed in that, then honestly, believing in phantom banqueting halls feels pretty reasonable. The path angles toward the river and you follow, stepping carefully. This stretch once bordered the palace's riverside entrance. You picture boats sliding across the Thames, aristocrats stepping onto richly carved docks, courtiers clutching gossip the way modern people clutch overpriced lattes. The river shimmered here, reflecting lantern light and royal ambition in equal measure. Tonight its reflection is subtle, pale, trembling under moonlight. Your feet reach a spot where the great privy lodgings once stood, private chambers that held the king's most intimate routines, decisions, fears, and triumphs. You can practically sense the shift. The air gets stiller, as if holding its breath. Historians describe these rooms as intensely personal, filled with tapestries, gilded furniture, and the political tension of whoever was granted the privilege to be near Henry at any given moment. You take a slow step, feeling the ghosts of those decisions ripple faintly around you. Everything sharpens here, the soft crunch of pebbles, the steady thrum of your pulse, the faint echo of something you can't define. The palace may be gone, but this space remembers the weight of power lodged inside its walls. It remembers betrayals whispered behind velvet curtains. It remembers midnight discussions that reshaped nations. It remembers the sound of a man who bent the country to his will and paid the price in pain, paranoia, and loneliness. You exhale slowly, letting the quiet settle. You drift toward the area that once held the Chapel Royal, a place where music spilled like incense into the rafters. Choir boys' voices soared here, unbroken, piercing enough to make hardened soldiers weep. Now the only music is the soft brushing of your coat against your side. But you imagine the sound anyway, a pure, trembling chord held impossibly long, echoing through time. You pause, wobbling slightly as a stray cat darts past your feet like a furry comet with a mission. It stops, glances back at you, and then disappears into a tangle of shrubs. You whisper a regal, "Very well, my lord," because if any creature inherited Whitehall's swagger, it's that cat. You lift your face toward the sky. Clouds drift lazily across the moon, smearing silver across the night. The palace rises in your mind one last time, vast, colorful, loud, impossible, then slowly dissolves into the darkness like breath fading from a mirror. You stand still for a long moment, letting the silence do what it does best. Hold you gently in its palms, remind you that even the grandest human creations eventually melt back into the earth. Tonight, Whitehall isn't gone. It's simply sleeping beneath your feet, trusting you to tell the story it can't tell for itself. You drift away from the ghost grid of Whitehall, and the night folds around you like a warm, heavy blanket. The hum of distant London life fades behind you, replaced by a quieter, more contemplative kind of darkness. As your feet crunch along a soft path, the landscape shifts, not into wilderness exactly, but into a gentler countryside where the remnants of a once grand residence lie disguised beneath farmland and whispering hedgerows. You're approaching Oatlands, a palace that refuses to announce itself, preferring instead to hide in plain sight like a shy celebrity avoiding paparazzi. The moon casts a cool glow across rolling fields. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then decides it's too late at night to care about anything. You breathe in damp earth and faint river air. Oatlands sat close to the Thames, and the land still holds that smell, clean, soft, a touch mineral, like the ghost of old waterways. You angle toward a slight rise. The kind you wouldn't look at twice unless you knew it once supported enough architecture to impress a king with very high standards and an even higher ego. A mainstream fact floats gently into your thoughts. Henry VIII acquired Oatlands in the 1530s and rebuilt it extensively, transforming it into a sprawling riverside residence for Anne of Cleves. Well, for her in the Tudor sense, which meant, I'll renovate it, but I may or may not intend to spend actual time here. The whole palace ended up being used by multiple queens, each leaving traces in its layout and gardens like passing moods. You step forward, imagining those walls rising around you, soft beige stone warmed by the sun, chimneys tall enough to signal maritime traffic. The night is quiet enough that your footsteps sound too loud, as though you're intruding on something private. Maybe you are. Oatlands wasn't a palace of theatrical spectacle like Whitehall or Nonsuch. It was a place of retreat, domesticity, quieter luxuries, long galleries for walking, rooms for contemplation, windows that frame the river with deliberate serenity. You feel that quiet in your bones as the darkness settles deeper. You wander through what would have been the outer courtyard. It's invisible now but strangely spatial. Your body senses boundaries even though your eyes insist nothing is there. You pause, tilting your head slightly. The faint rustle of leaves overhead sounds almost like the swish of queenly skirts. Your mind, helpful as ever, supplies the image. Catherine Howard strolling here, perhaps whispering confidences to her ladies, unaware of how short her time in the sun would be. You murmur softly. Historians still argue whether Catherine spent significant time at Oatlands, letting the idea drift like mist. A fringe tidbit nudges up from the margins of history. Some local tailies claimed a secret tunnel once connected the palace cellars to the riverbank, allegedly to allow discreet nighttime departures, either for royal privacy or smuggling, depending on who's telling the story and how much they've had to drink. You grin at the thought. A Tudor secret tunnel feels exactly on brand. If we can accept medieval mascara mixed with burnt clove ash, we can definitely accept tunnels. The air shifts as you step into what would have been the privy garden. Even though the plants are long gone, the space retains a kind of geometric memory. You picture patterned beds of herbs, roses trained along trellises, little pavilions offering shade and shadows in equal measure. The palace's orchard stretched beyond this point: apples, pears, cherries, fruits that would have perfumed the air in summer, transforming the entire place into a Tudor dessert. You ease further in, feeling the ground soften beneath your feet. Dew clings to the grass, shimmering faintly. You pause, inhaling deeply. There's a crisp sweetness to the air, like the land is exhaling the last ghost of its gardens. It's strangely comforting. Oatlands feels less like an abandoned palace and more like a retired one, content to rest, no longer burdened by royal expectations. You push gently through the imagined thresholds of the great hall. It once stood wide and warm, lit by crackling fires and filled with long tables, laughter, gossip, and clinking cups. The firelight would have danced across timbered beams, tapestries, and polished pewter. Now only shadows remain, but they move softly, as if remembering. You let them swirl around you like old friends. A soft hoot from an owl echoes across the fields. You glance toward the sound, half expecting a figure to appear, maybe a royal huntsman or a startled servant or Henry himself wandering the corridors in insomnia-fueled brooding. Instead, the owl flaps silently away, leaving only the faint whisper of its wings. You bow your head slightly toward the darkness. Your palace now, you murmur. You drift toward the river's edge, where the palace once opened into terraces. The Thames glints like a silver ribbon under the moon, its gentle current licking the bank. In the Tudor era, court barges would have docked here, brightly painted vessels, musicians playing, courtiers fluttering about with both elegance and anxiety. You can imagine the lanterns glowing against the water, casting trembling patterns that shimmered across stone walls. Tonight the water is quieter, more confident in its solitude. You crouch down, dipping your fingers into the river. It's colder than you expect, shockingly fresh, like the world reminding you that history is never as distant as textbooks pretend. Ripples glide outward, gentle and slow. For a moment, you imagine they bounce against the hull of a long-vanished royal barge. You rise and step backward into the grassy remains of what used to be the Queen's chambers. These walls held conversations too soft for chroniclers, arguments too private for ambassadors, laughter too delicate for royal accounts. The chambers would have smelled of beeswax, linen, rosewater. Now, the air holds only the clean scent of open fields, but your mind fills in the missing fragrances anyway. You walk along the line where a gallery once stood, a long corridor for strolling during rainy days. Your footsteps make a soft rhythm that feels like a heartbeat, steady and grounding. As you walk, you brush your fingertips through the air, almost feeling the ghost texture of worn floorboards. A small fox appears at the edge of the field, pauses, stares at you like it's assessing whether you belong here. Then, apparently satisfied, it settles down, curling its tail around its feet. You smile. If Tudor palaces devolved to anyone, it's creatures like this, quiet, observant, slightly judgmental. You angle back through the imaginary great court until you reach a place where the night feels thicker, heavier, as if wrapping itself around the last walls that remain only in memory. You pause there, letting the deep quiet settle across your shoulders. Oatlands doesn't roar like Whitehall or shimmer like Nonsuch. It hums. Soft, steady, a gentle note that lingers in your chest. You exhale slowly, letting that hum settle deeper. Tonight, you walk a palace that once held queens, secrets, gardens, hushed hopes, and which now rests peacefully under the moon, still holding its shape in the imagination of anyone willing to tread softly enough to hear it. You leave the soft exhale of Oatlands behind, stepping into a darkness that feels somehow deeper, older, more layered with forgotten footsteps and abandoned ambitions. The air cools as you move, whispering across your cheeks like the faintest reminder that you're slipping toward another place Henry VIII once touched, one that has almost vanished entirely beneath centuries of silence. You're heading toward Hanworth, a residence less flashy, less theatrically royal, but curiously alive in the margins of Tudor memory. It's the kind of place you could walk past without realizing a queen once paced here, worrying about her future or plotting her next chess move in the ever-tilting court. The path you follow is thin and slightly uneven, lined with long grasses that sigh as your legs brush through. Somewhere in the distance, a horse stamps and snorts, modern, domestic, utterly unaware that horses once thundered here under far more dramatic circumstances. You slip through a break in the hedge and step onto land that feels subtly arranged, as though something once stood here with purpose, order, and a stern sense of hierarchy. Hanworth was never a palace built to dazzle. It was a retreat, a refuge, a place for quiet politics and quieter regrets. Henry visited, yes, but the estate became most famously associated with Catherine Parr, his last queen, the one who managed to keep her head by the clever, exhausted skin of her teeth. A mainstream fact drifts up like a lantern glow. Catherine Parr lived at Hanworth after Henry's death, using it as both sanctuary and strategy base during her marriage to Thomas Seymour. Imagine that, trying to enjoy domestic life with a man charming enough to rewrite sonnets, but chaotic enough to make every political advisor break into stress sweats. You step across the grassy ghost of Hanworth's old forecourt. Your feet find a natural rectangle of space, wider than the surrounding fields, as if the ground refuses to forget its former proportions. You pause, breathing in a soft mixture of dew, late-night soil, and the quiet mineral tang of old brick buried deep. The moonlight breaks through thin clouds, illuminating a patch of ground that once supported a grand entrance hall, timber-framed and warm, smelling of rushes and wood smoke. You imagine Catherine Parr moving through these corridors, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, her footsteps soft, her mind racing with the delicate balance she had to maintain, widow of a king, stepmother to a future queen and future king, and wife to a man with ambitions too sharp for his own good. Historians still argue whether Catherine felt truly safe at Hanworth. You whisper into the darkness, letting the idea settle like dust onto the earth. You shift forward, picturing the hall rising around you in soft wooden hues, beams stretching overhead, tapestries insulating the walls. The air grows quieter, denser, like a library holding its breath. A fringe tidbit surfaces, making you grin. Some old accounts claim that Hanworth was rumored to have a restless horse ghost, supposedly Henry's favorite mount, said to be heard clomping around long after both king and animal were gone. You pause, listening. The fields remain stubbornly silent, offering only the faint trill of a night insect. Maybe the ghost horse has the night off. You cross into the phantom great chamber, a space that feels broad even in darkness. Your steps slow, instinctively cautious, as though not wanting to disturb conversations that might be lingering in the rafters. This room would have hosted meals, meetings, petitions, and the occasional heated argument disguised with polite smiles. You sense the tension that must have simmered here during Catherine Parr's later years. Concerns about her household, her controversial writings, her place in the dangerously shifting religious landscape. The night folds around you like careful parchment as you imagine the Queen's ladies moving through this space, whispering over embroidery frames, glancing nervously toward the door every time someone approached. The Tudor world thrived on rumor, after all. You blow gently across your fingertips, amused. If only they knew how calm this place would one day become, replaced by quiet trees, soft grass, and the occasional squirrel who absolutely believes it owns the property. You step outside the vanished chamber and onto land that once formed a garden terrace. The ground slopes ever so slightly, guiding you toward what would have been Catherine Parr's private garden, smaller than most royal greens, but curated with intention. You close your eyes and picture lavender, rosemary, sweet briar roses, and medicinal herbs she might have used in her healing balms. Catherine was known for her intellect and her gentle skill in caring for others. This garden likely held plants chosen not just for beauty, but for usefulness. You inhale, imagining the fragrance rising in warm summer air. Tonight, the scents are simpler: grass, distant chimney smoke from unseen houses, the faint sweetness of damp leaves. But somehow, your mind fills in the richer aromas anyway. You step carefully, almost reverently, as though Catherine herself might wander beside you, telling you about her favorite mint plant or lamenting the state of Tudor court politics with the dry humor she was known for. A sudden rustle breaks the stillness. You turn, expecting perhaps a fox or a hedgehog, but instead a small deer lifts its head from the shadows, staring at you with wide, unbothered eyes. You both freeze. Then with quiet dignity it wanders off, clearly deciding you pose no threat. You exhale, chuckling softly. "Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen," you murmur. History has produced weirder things than a deer inspecting a human in a ghost palace. You move toward the outline of what might have been the chapel, a modest building compared to the grand royal ones, but deeply personal to Catherine. The air changes as you step into that space. It feels stiller, somehow rounder, like a breath held just behind closed lips. Here, Catherine Parr prayed, worried, hoped, wrote, and occasionally plotted. Faith guided her, but fear shadowed her. You can almost feel the weight of her decisions pressing into the ground. Your shoes scuff against a line of slightly raised earth, perhaps hiding old foundations beneath. You pause, running your fingers lightly over the grass. The silence here is reverent. Even the wind seems reluctant to intrude. You linger a moment longer than necessary, letting the quiet settle deep into your chest. When you finally move, it's toward what would have been the stables, an area now overgrown, wild, reclaimed fully by time. You sweep your hand gently through the tall grasses, imagining grooms bustling, horses stamping, leather creaking, hay dust swirling. A place once full of movement now holds only stillness, interrupted occasionally by small night creatures doing whatever it is small night creatures do. You continue on, letting your steps lead you instinctively along where old pathways might have twisted between halls and service buildings. Hanworth wasn't grand in the way of palaces like Hampton Court, but it had warmth, life, a pulse. You can still feel it. It clings gently to the air, faint but persistent, like a memory that refuses to fully fade. You stop at the heart of the estate, the place where Catherine's private apartments once stood. The ground is flat here, almost unnervingly flat, as if time flattened it deliberately, smoothing away the weight of royal footsteps. You let your shoulders relax, standing quietly in the center. It feels right to pause here. This was a place where a woman who survived one of history's most dangerous marriages finally found a measure of peace. Your breath softens. The night wraps itself around you more closely now, as though acknowledging the gravity of the place. Nothing dramatic remains, no walls, no carvings, no stonework. And yet something lingers, a gentleness, a resilience. You turn slowly, absorbing the darkness, the softness of the fields, the silence that feels earned. Hanworth is not a loud sight, it's not a show-off, it's a whisper, a relief, a breath let out. And tonight, you inhale that breath deeply, feeling the quiet strength of a palace that has slipped almost entirely from sight but not from the land's memory. You walk through it as if listening to a story being told faintly, lovingly, in the dark. You leave the hush of the last landscape behind you, stepping once more into the drifting dark, and the path bends, almost reluctantly, toward a valley drowned in shadow. Otford rises only when you are close enough to nearly tread upon it, and even then it does not rise with confidence. It is a ghost in the grass, a suggestion of angles, a place where power once built itself too high and then found the ground beneath unwilling to bear the weight. You feel the shift before you see anything, the air tightening, the soil softening. There is something sodden here, though the night is dry, something soaked not in water but in memory. When the moon finally peers out from behind a gauze of cloud, its light skims the valley floor like a thin blade, revealing the faint gridwork of earthworks, low ridges, swallowed cellars, fragments of foundations that no longer insist on being seen. You stop at the edge of the great square that once held Archbishop William Warham's dream, a palace so large, so unapologetically grand that it might have rivaled, or even surpassed, the power of the king himself. And for a moment, as you draw breath, you hear it, the ambition, the defiance, the unspoken dare. You step onto the ghost's threshold, and the night breathes out long and slow around you. Here once, stone walls rose 3 stories high, locking together like clasped fingers. Here once, 40-foot towers stood at the corners, upright, unblinking, asserting that the Archbishop of Canterbury was no man's subordinate. Warham had built with confidence, the kind born not from arrogance but from long familiarity with influence. You imagine him standing where you stand now, directing masons as they shaped vaults, calculating the necessary distance between courtyards, approving the use of dolting stone with a nod that suggested inevitability. He had lived through Henry VII's rule, advised kings, crowned Henry VII himself, settled treaties, brokered peace. And here in Otford, he had allowed himself a rare indulgence, splendor without apology. But you know, as you stand in the stillness, that splendor is a dangerous companion. A cold wind snakes along the ditch lines, faint remnants of what were once vast fish ponds, and it curls around your ankles like a cat that never learned the habit of warmth. You cross a shallow rise where the great North Range once lifted its beams into the sky, and with each step it feels as though the earth is trying to tell you its story, syllable by sodden syllable. You kneel near the faint outline of a doorway, its threshold sunken, its stones long gone. Your fingertips brush against the tufted grass, and suddenly the place wakes. In the dark, the palace reforms. You do not see it with your eyes, but with the strange clarity of memory not your own. Timbered galleries appear like ribs of a long-forgotten beast. Stained glass windows bloom against the night with improbable color. The sound of water plashing in a great courtyard fountain seems to drift through the years and settle in your ears. You lift your head and feel the presence of hundreds, servants hurrying with tapestries, clerics carrying scrolls, cooks elbow-deep in spiced stews, gardeners trimming rosemary hedges along paths paved with crushed chalk. Otford was a world unto itself, a place of awe and not merely for its size. You walk through the ghost of Warham's Great Hall. The space around you expands, impossibly vast, as though the air remembers its own dimensions. Once, that hall hosted feasts where diplomatic nerves were smoothed with capons roasted in verjuice, where the soft rustle of velvet robes joined the quiet clink of pewter, where Warham soothed tempers, negotiated compromises, or celebrated victories. The hearth would have been great enough for 4 men to stand abreast within it. The smoke would have climbed into a hammer-beam roof carved with saints and strange beasts that glowed in the candlelight. But as you cross the hall's phantom center, the air shifts. The stone groans only in memory, yet insistently, and you feel the ground dip beneath you. You think of Henry VIII, the king whose hunger for dominance was as boundless as his appetite for change. A king who could never let another man's magnificence rise too high above the horizon. You feel the tension coil in the stillness. Otford's splendor was not merely architectural, it was political. Warham's palace dared to rival the king. And what king tolerates a rival, even in stone? The night tightens around you. You move toward what remains, both physically and in imagination, of the southern gatehouse. A few stones still survive above ground, modest fragments half sunken, like the bones of something large that died slowly. You rest your palm against the cold edge of one. It is rough, surprisingly sharp, as though the years have filed it down into truth. You can feel, faintly, the vibration of past footsteps. Bishops in heavy robes, secretaries with ink-stained fingers, visitors from across the channel who arrived astonished at the archbishop's wealth. And then you feel another vibration beneath all that. A shift, a refusal, the land itself rebelling. Otford's curse, you realize, was not simply royal jealousy. It was geography. The palace stood on flood-prone ground, a marshy valley that wanted reeds, not rivalry. The glimmer at the northern edge, the ghost of the river Darren, reminds you of winter storms and swollen banks. Year after year, water seeped beneath foundations. Mold crept along the lower chambers, and the great fish ponds overflowed, turning courtyards into sucking, boot-stealing mire. You picture masons cursing as they reinforced, patched, rebuilt, always fighting nature, always losing ground. Literally. No wonder the grandeur could not last. You cross the shadow of the privy garden. Nothing remains except faint ridges, but in your mind it blooms. Quince trees trained against warmed walls, lavender hedges trimmed into knots, boxwood clipped to precise geometry, a stone path leading to a small pavilion where Warham might have taken his cautious leisure. You sit for a moment on the ghost bench, feeling the dampness of the earth seep through the imagined slats. The night around you trembles with something like regret, as though the land itself mourns the beauty that once attempted to anchor itself here. But you know that beauty is never destroyed, it only shifts form. When Henry VIII acquired the palace after Warham's death, more by inevitability than outright force, he barely used it. The king preferred palaces with firmer foundations and clearer skis. Otford lingered under royal ownership, useful mainly for its lands, not its buildings. Without patronage, its decline quickened. By the time decades passed, roofs sagged, walls slipped, and the palace, so recently a marvel, became a burden. Sections were dismantled for building materials. Villagers carried off stones for barns and hearths. Walls became quarries for the practical needs of the valley. You rise and walk to the site of what was once the great South Court. Here, the moonlight thickens, illuminating dips and hollows where cellars collapsed. At one point, you find yourself stepping around a depression where a storeroom once held barrels of wine and salted fish. The night wind sighs as though releasing centuries of stored breath. You imagine the palace fatting in slow stages, first the glass, then the roofs, then the beams, until only the lowest stones clung to the earth, stubborn and waterlogged. It is then, standing amid this drowned splendor, that you sense the palace's final emotion. Not shame, not defeat, but acceptance. This place tried to outshine a king. It dared to build higher, broader, and more beautifully than a monarch's pride would ever allow. And although the palace sank, into the wet soil, into obscurity, into the confused memory of the realm, It left an imprint too large to erase. You walk toward the exit of the ghost estate. A faint mist rises from the ground, curling low over the grass as though traces of the fish pond still breathe beneath the surface. Each step carries a soft squelch, not of water but of earth remembering its own story. You look back once, just once, and the valley shifts. For a heartbeat, you see the palace as it was, tall, illuminated, ringing with life. Then the vision folds away, leaving only the moonlit grass. You continue along the path, deeper into the night, carrying with you the ache of Otford, a splendor drowned, an ambition undone, a reminder that even the grandest dreams must kneel before time, land, and kings. You walk on through the night, leaving behind the drowned ruins of Otford, and as the path settles into a long, thoughtful curve, you begin to sense a change in the air. Not a shift of weather, but a shift in understanding. All night you have wandered from vanished palace to vanished palace, some crumbled, some erased, some swallowed by fields or villages or time, and the weight of their absence presses softly against your ribs. You have seen the remnants, felt the ghosts, and stepped along the footprints of kings. Now the night seems to invite you closer, as though it wants to explain something, to peel back the centuries and show you why the glittering world Henry VIII built has faded almost completely from the map. You slow your pace, letting the cool darkness settle around you. The path opens into a bare clearing, silent and wide, a blank page in the landscape. It feels intentional, like a space cleared for thinking rather than building. You draw a breath, and the night begins to speak through memory. You realize first that disappearance is not simple. These palaces did not all fall for the same reason. They were unmade by a tangle of forces, by fire and politics, rivalry and indifference, the slow creep of nature, the shifting appetites of monarchs, the changing needs of a nation, and the hard truth that grandeur costs more to maintain than to dream. You think of Henry VIII himself, the man who raised these palaces like a constellation across England. A builder of excess, a king of restless ambition, a monarch who needed the world to reflect him in gold, stone, and ceremony. Yet even he could not make permanence obey him. You take another step, and your mind drifts first to fire, the oldest and most eager undoer of splendor. Many Tudor palaces were built in an age when heat came from open hearths, when kitchens roared with flame and smoke, when tallow candles flickered along every passageway. Timber roofs, linen-hung walls, thatched outbuildings, and drafty hallways created a kingdom, always one spark away from disaster. Greenwich, where Henry VIII was born, suffered fire after fire. So did Hampton's lost wings, Richmond's galleries, and swathes of Nonsuch's timbered quarters. Even when flames did not take an entire palace, they wounded it enough to invite neglect. Once the king no longer slept in a place, repairs became an indulgence, not a necessity. A burned roof could be ignored. A damaged range could be left to sag. Fire did not always destroy. Sometimes it merely nudged a palace toward abandonment. But fire was only one threat. You walk deeper into the clearing, hearing now the whisper of another eraser: politics. The Tudor court was not a peaceful place, neither in temperament nor in structure. When kings shifted loyalties, the buildings that symbolized those loyalties shifted with them. Henry VIII took Otford from Archbishop Warham not because he needed another palace, but because the very scale of it felt like a challenge. Cardinal Wolsey's palaces suffered similarly. York Place became Whitehall after Wolsey's fall, and the cardinal's other homes were quietly redistributed, their splendor repurposed to reinforce the king's supremacy. Palaces were not merely residences, they were symbols of power, and symbols are fragile in the hands of monarchs who rule through dominance. Politics continued to erase long after Henry died. The Civil War saw royalist palaces stripped, looted, or deliberately dismantled by parliamentary forces who wanted to make monarchy physically impossible. After the Restoration, some palaces were too far gone to reclaim. Others were sold off to settle debts, swallowed by aristocrats whose families later sold the land again. Whitehall, one of Henry's greatest creations, was undone not only by fire but by political exhaustion. When the monarchy returned after Cromwell's republic, the money and will to rebuild were gone. You pause, realizing that politics is not simply the enemy of buildings. It is the engine that moves nations forward, often leaving architecture behind. But there is a third undoer, quieter and slow: neglect. You think of Henry VII's personal habits, his constant movement, his craving for novelty. He rarely stayed in one place long enough to wear grooves into a floor. The Tudor court was a traveling machine. Lords, ladies, servants, pack animals, furniture, tapestries, kitchens, breweries, all rolling from palace to palace like a small city on the move. And because the king did not live permanently anywhere, each palace required near-constant upkeep even when empty. Chimneys needed sweeping, roofs needed patching, gardens needed clipping, sewers needed clearing. A palace built for splendor could stand ruinously empty for months at a time. Little by little, neglect seeped into the stones. Rain found weaknesses in the roof lines. Snow pressed too heavily on beams. Frost pried apart mortar. Animals nested in quiet corners. Roots clawed into cracks. Wind rattled loose shutters until they fell. Over decades, empty palaces became expensive responsibilities, and responsibilities without purpose become burdens. When newer monarchs preferred Windsor or Kensington or the modernizing comforts of Georgian design, Tudor palaces lost not only relevance but caretakers. Without money, without courtly presence, without a reason to survive, they withered. Then comes the iron hand beneath all this: ambition. You think of Henry VII's restless desire to outbuild every ruler in Europe. His palaces were not created for timelessness. They were created for spectacle. Tiltyards, banqueting houses, hunting lodges, galleries stretching impossibly long, riverfront gateways gilded and carved. These were extravagant gestures, not practical lifelong residences. Palaces like Nonsuch were built to stun, to intimidate, to awe foreign ambassadors. Their maintenance cost a fortune, their materials weathered quickly, and their very novelty ensured they would either be endlessly updated or left behind by changing fashion. Ambition demands change. Change demands replacement. Replacement demands that old things fall away. Nonsuch disappeared almost overnight, not because fire or war consumed it, but because a duchess needed money and ambition had built something too elaborate to be saved. Sold, dismantled, quarried piece by piece, its stones repurposed into other houses, its plasterwork ground into dust. A palace once famed across Europe was erased in less than 2 decades. You feel the weight of ambition differently now, as both creation and destruction in the same breath. But there is yet another culprit in these vanishings: the land itself. You remember Otford's sinking walls, Richmond's riverbank eroding year by year, Greenwich's constant damp, and Kennington's marshy underbelly. Many Tudor palaces stood in places chosen not for stability but for convenience, near hunting forests, rivers, or roads. The ground beneath them shifted, flooded, softened, or cracked with time. Climate patterns changed. Rivers altered course. Forests shrank. Land is patient, but it always wins. You let the night expand around you and consider all these forces converging: fire, politics, neglect, ambition, shifting earth. And you realize that none of Henry VII's vanished palaces disappeared for a single reason. They disappeared because the world around them changed faster than stone could keep up. Even the ones that survive, Hampton Court, parts of Greenwich, fragments of Whitehall, survive not because they were unbreakable, but because someone at some moment decided they were worth saving. You continue walking, and the clearing begins to fade into a gentle slope leading upward. The horizon brightens with the faintest hint of dawn, a pale wash of silver threaded with rose. The night has carried you through the kingdom of what was lost, and now the daylight seems ready to carry you toward what remains. You pause one last time, breathing in the cool air as though drawing the entire journey into your lungs. You understand now that vanished palaces are not failures. They are stories. Their disappearance tells you as much about their age, their kings, and their kingdom as their existence ever could. They remind you that splendor is a moment, not a guarantee. That buildings serve people, and when people move on, stone eventually follows. And most importantly, they remind you that memory is a form of preservation more powerful than walls. The sun lifts a little higher, brushing the landscape with the first real light of morning. As you turn toward it, leaving the long night of Henry VII's lost world behind, you carry with you the truth you have gathered across your journey. That disappearance is never simple, and that the echoes of these palaces still shape the land, the stories, and the imagination of anyone willing to walk their forgotten paths. The day opens before you, and the vanished kingdom breathes on, alive in you now, as quietly enduring as dawn itself. The night folds in around you now, softer than silk, quieter than breath. After wandering through lost courtyards and vanished chambers, after tracing the fading footsteps of kings and workers and forgotten lives, you finally feel the long arc of the journey settling low in your body. Your shoulders loosen, your steps slow. The air seems warmer somehow, as though the world itself is easing you toward rest. You close your eyes for a moment and the palaces drift gently behind your mind's eyelids. Hampton's quiet corners, Nonsuch's broken brilliance, Otford's drowned silhouette. They no longer feel like ruins, just memories now. Soft shapes, fading colors, nothing demanding your attention, nothing tugging you forward. The weight of history has melted into something feather-light, something that hums rather than echoes. You breathe in, slow and steady, and the ground beneath you seems to steady with it. Each exhale lets another piece of the night dissolve into calm. The wind moves through the grass with a low, rhythmic hush, almost like the ocean brushing a quiet shore. Even the stars look tired, dimming into a gentle shimmer. You let yourself drift with that softness. The stories you've traveled through begin to quiet, their edges blurring like ink touched by water. Nothing sharp remains, just gentle impressions, warm and distant, safe to sink into. Whatever questions linger about kings or palaces or time itself can wait until morning. The world expects nothing of you right now. Another breath, another slow settling. Your thoughts stretch out, long and loose, like they're getting ready to lie down before you do. The night holds you without hurry, without noise, without any need to continue moving. And as everything around you softens into stillness, you feel yourself floating gently toward sleep, carried by the calm you've earned. Sweet dreams.